In a world where love and obsession collide, one man is about to discover a truth that could unravel everything he thought he knew. Beneath the surface of a quaint, seemingly peaceful village lies a hidden path, a path where secrets are buried and desires lead to deadly consequences. Tonight, Mr. Satterthwaite will face something far more sinister than he ever expected, and the shadows will reveal a truth that no one is prepared for. Will he be able to solve the mystery before it's too late, or is he already too far down the lane? The whispers of Blackwood Lane. Mr. Julian Harrow could never quite explain why he kept returning to Blackwood Manor. The estate, nestled on the edge of a fog-laden moor, held no particular charm for him. The Blackwoods were not his kind, neither fascinating aristocrats nor intellectual minds of any merit. They were plain, reserved, and yet disturbingly enigmatic. And yet, here he was, on the 1st of October, speeding through the countryside in his immaculate Bentley, heading once more toward that silent house with its unsettling past. Arthur Blackwood, the master of the house, was a man of rigid mannerisms, his conversations clipped and efficient, his eyes holding a permanent shadow. His wife, Eleanor, was a woman of eerie stillness, her voice soft yet curiously devoid of warmth. Their home, grand and imposing, carried a presence of its own, whispering secrets through its cold stone corridors. There was no logical reason for Julian's continued visits, except for one thing: a single room, a locked study on the eastern wing of the house, that no guest was ever permitted to enter. He had glimpsed it once, just a crack through the heavy mahogany door. Within, a massive antique mirror stood, its frame an intricate weave of gold and onyx, its surface oddly clouded, as though time itself had blurred its reflection. There was something profoundly unsettling about it. It didn't belong there, much like Eleanor Blackwood herself, whose origins remained a mystery. She was not from England, that much he knew. Arthur had brought her back with him from a war-torn country long ago, defying his family's wishes. But there was something else, something unspoken. Tonight, as Julian arrived at Blackwood Manor, a thick mist curled around the grand iron gates, slithering across the courtyard like ghostly fingers. The butler greeted him with an expression too polite, too rehearsed. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood will join you shortly, sir," he murmured before disappearing into the shadows. Alone, Julian wandered through the dimly lit halls, his steps echoing against the polished floors. The study door loomed before him, silent, forbidding, and then, ever so faintly, he heard it, a whisper, a voice that should not have been there. It came from inside the locked room. The road stretched endlessly under the dusky sky, winding its way through the quiet countryside. Mr. Elliot Harrow had never quite understood why he kept returning to Ravenshade Manor. It was a house that held no warmth, no lively company, and certainly no shared interests with the kind of people he preferred to associate with. And yet, something about the place always seemed to call him back. As his car glided through the narrow, mist-cloaked lanes, he pondered the absurdity of it all. Was it curiosity, a sense of unfinished business, or perhaps something deeper, something unspoken, lingering in the very air of that house? His thoughts circled back to a single object, an ornate mirror in the drawing room, a relic from a forgotten era. Unlike the rest of the manor's decor, staunchly British, refined yet predictable, the mirror was disturbingly out of place. It was Venetian, its gilded frame twisted into grotesque shapes, its glass oddly warped as if time itself had rippled across its surface. He had glimpsed something in it once, or had it been someone? A trick of the light, surely. Yet here he was, returning, as though drawn by invisible threads. The manor stood in silence as he arrived, its stone walls swallowing the last hints of twilight. The butler, a man of few words and fewer expressions, informed him that the hosts were out, at a rehearsal no less. Strange, given that neither Mr. nor Mrs. Denham had ever displayed an interest in the arts. With no company to greet him, Harrow wandered into the garden, the scent of damper night-blooming jasmine thick in the air. His footsteps led him to an iron gate at the edge of the property, slightly ajar. Beyond it, a pathway stretched into the woods, shrouded in a dense whispering darkness. The sign on the gate read, "Gallows Lane." He hesitated. That name, it stirred something deep within his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. With a sharp breath he stepped through, and the air grew noticeably colder. The path twisted and turned, flanked by towering hedges that seemed to close in as he walked. And then, without warning, he saw it, a figure standing at the end of the lane, barely illuminated by the dying light, watching, waiting, unmoving. Harrow's breath hitched. He took a cautious step forward. "Who's there?" he called out. No answer, just the heavy silence of the lane, and the pulse of something unseen lurking just beyond his reach. Under the golden hues of the setting sun, Mr. Satterthwaite and Mr. Quin walked in unspoken understanding, their steps echoing softly against the worn path of the secluded lane. "This place has seen many lovers, hasn't it?" mused Mr. Satterthwaite, his voice tinged with an odd mixture of nostalgia and curiosity. Quin, ever enigmatic, merely inclined his head. "And you, Mr. Quin, you have done much for them. You have guided them, saved them from sorrow, even from death." He stopped, glancing at Quin with something close to reverence. "But you never act directly, do you? You always work through others." There was a pause, a moment stretched too thin. Then, in a voice low and weighted, Quin replied, "Sometimes I do." A sudden, inexplicable chill laced the warm air, and Mr. Satterthwaite found himself suppressing a shiver. Just then, a figure emerged from the turn ahead, a young woman, golden-haired, dressed in a soft blue dress that danced with the wind. Her presence was like an echo of forgotten memories, something both familiar and unsettling. "John and Anna have just gone back," she called, her voice light, yet carrying an undertone of urgency. "They left in a hurry, something about a rehearsal, but I feel something isn't right." Her words lingered in the air, unsettled, like dust before a storm. "A rehearsal?" Mr. Satterthwaite asked, masking his unease. "Yes, a masquerade performance," she explained. "Dancing, music, Harlequin, Columbine, the usual." But there was a falter in her voice, a hesitation that did not belong. A name surfaced then, Claude Wickham, a man known to Mr. Satterthwaite, an eccentric mind hidden behind thick horn-rimmed spectacles, always animated, always devouring life, sometimes too greedily. They found him at the Denmans' tea table, his long fingers fluttering like restless birds, his words tumbling out too fast, too eager. And yet, beneath the surface of lively chatter, there was something else, a whisper of something unseen, a quiet lurking darkness. Mr. Quin, ever watchful, remained silent, but his gaze was sharp, knowing. The air grew heavier, charged with something unspoken. It was then that Mr. Satterthwaite understood. This was no ordinary evening, no ordinary masquerade. Something hidden loomed just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, ready to unfold. Beneath the dim glow of the antique chandelier, the air in the drawing room was thick with an unspoken tension. Lionel Graves, a man of precise mannerisms and a calculating gaze, lounged in his chair with an air of idle disinterest, though his eyes missed nothing. Across from him Veronica Henshaw sat behind the silver-plated tea set, her porcelain-like features unreadable, her fingers moving with deliberate grace as she poured. She had the kind of face that concealed more than it revealed, delicate, yet hardened, like glass that had withstood storms. Mr. Ashford, an observer by nature and a man who thrived on the unspoken, studied her with quiet curiosity. There was something hollow about her stillness, a vacancy behind those carefully neutral eyes, as though she existed in a world entirely separate from the one around her. A woman like that, so composed, so rigid, ought to hold a secret. And yet, the puzzle of her presence was unsettlingly simple. There was no mystery in her at all. And that, thought Mr. Ashford, was precisely what was wrong. "You were saying," he murmured to the man seated beside him, breaking the silence. The interruption hardly slowed Nathaniel Vance, a self-proclaimed intellectual with grandiose opinions, who had been in the middle of an impassioned monologue about the state of modern artistry. His hands moved wildly as he spoke, a half-eaten biscuit in one and a delicate champagne glass in the other. "Art should be dangerous," he declared, between bites. "Take the great tragedies, the real masterpieces, emotion, risk, chaos, that's what makes something immortal." He waved the glass in the air, nearly spilling its contents. Veronica's voice, calm and measured, cut through his theatrics like a knife. "Before my marriage, I was a dancer, so now, the spectacle no longer interests me." The words silenced the room for a fraction too long. "A busman's holiday," her husband quipped dryly from the corner, a smirk tugging at his lips. Nathaniel, momentarily thrown off, recovered quickly. A dancer, you? And yet, you don't watch performances. I know all the tricks, she said with a slow shrug, her expression unchanging. The illusion has no magic once you've been behind the curtain. Oh, a flicker of something disappointment crossed Nathaniel's face, but in the next breath, he latched onto another thread. Speaking of art and tragedy, he leaned in, eyes gleaming. Tell me, Ashford, you were in Paris once, weren't you? Surely you saw her, the legendary Ivana Morozov. Mr. Ashford, usually a man of tempered reactions, let the faintest glimmer of nostalgia touch his expression. 3 times, he said quietly, twice in Vienna, once in London. I will not forget it. A hush fell over the gathering. I was 10, Nathaniel admitted. My uncle took me to see her. God, I shall never forget it. And with an uncharacteristic abruptness, he hurled the remainder of his biscuit into the crackling fire. The flames flickered higher for a moment, licking at the remnants of something long past. Beneath the golden glow of the chandelier, a slow tension wove itself into the air. Laurence Everley, poised yet vaguely indifferent, listened with the patience of a man who had mastered the art of appearing engaged while remaining entirely detached. Across from him, Miss Eleanor Vaughan poured tea with an unnerving precision, her face a mask of quiet reservation. Mr. Westcott, ever eager for an audience, shifted his attention towards Everley, launching into an impassioned discussion about the brilliance of Eastern philosophies. Eleanor, as always, remained silent, but Miss Harrow, seated in the corner, stole a glance at her, the kind of glance that lingered just a moment too long. She was tall, statuesque, and yet, there was something unnervingly hollow about her presence, like a painting missing its soul, a woman carved from porcelain, beautiful but devoid of warmth. And yet, something was wrong. The emptiness was too deliberate, a facade, or something far more unsettling. Harrow's thoughts were interrupted by Westcott's booming voice. Japan, Westcott declared. Now there's a country that understands reinvention, their traditions, their discipline, their sheer audacity in art. It's unparalleled. He bit into a sugared biscuit, crumbs scattering onto his lapel. Take the no theater, no frivolous exaggeration. Every movement is precise, every silence intentional. He turned to Eleanor then, as if just remembering she was present. What do you think of no theater? She did not hesitate. I have never seen it. Westcott faltered. What? But surely, I was a performer once, she said simply. I have no interest in watching others. Everley chuckled. A busman's holiday then. Eleanor only shrugged. I know the craft, the tricks, the illusions. It no longer amuses me. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Harrow leaned forward, intrigued. Speaking of performance, he said lightly, history is littered with those who shone too brightly, burned too fast. Westcott sat upright, sensing an argument. Ah, you're talking about Celeste Valmore, aren't you? He smacked the table excitedly. The greatest tragedian to ever grace the Parisian stage. Indeed, Harrow. Did you ever see her perform? Twice in London, once in Vienna. I will never forget it. His voice had softened, reverent. I saw her too, Westcott admitted. I was only a boy. My father took me. God, she was otherworldly. He threw his napkin onto the table in frustration, and to think she was lost, vanished into nothing after the fire at the Imperial. Fools, Everley muttered. Wasteful, tragic fools. A silence fell, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock, and then Eleanor spoke again, her voice quieter than before. I knew Celeste. Westcott nearly dropped his cup. You what? We trained together, she said. I knew her what?
And?
Harrow pressed. What was she like? Eleanor lifted her gaze, meeting Harrow's eyes with something unreadable. She was brilliant, she said, and she knew it. Harrow felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. There was something too final in those words, too weighted, as if Eleanor knew something the rest of them did not. The conversation drifted, Westcott growing increasingly animated, but Harrow barely listened. He watched Eleanor instead, noticed the way her hands rested too still against the porcelain teacup, noticed the absence of any personal artifacts in the room, no photographs, no keepsakes, no remnants of a life once lived, no history at all. And then, just as he was about to dismiss the thought, his gaze flickered to the far wall. A folding screen stood there, gold and lacquered, a relic of another time, and on its surface, a painted figure, dancing in flames. Harrow's breath caught. Eleanor followed his gaze, and for the first time that evening, she smiled, the first real expression he had seen from her all night. "There is a legend about her," said Mr. Davenport, his voice carrying the weight of years gone by. "In the Museum of Vienna, there is a sculpture, delicate, almost ethereal. It is as if the artist captured the very moment before she vanished from this world. I have seen her depicted as the moonlit sylph, in the Phantom Waltz, as the tragic muse." He paused, shaking his head with a wistful sigh. "She was irreplaceable, lost to the chaos of war, her name buried under the dust of forgotten tragedies." "Fools, barbarians!" exclaimed Charles Whitmore, his teacup rattling as he set it down with force. "To destroy something so exquisite, it's unforgivable." "I trained with Valenkova," murmured Evelyn Sinclair, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew her well." Mr. Davenport turned to her, his curiosity piqued. "And was she as extraordinary as they say?" Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unreadable. She was beyond words. Whitmore eventually excused himself, leaving the atmosphere lighter. John Sinclair exhaled, relieved, and his wife chuckled at his visible discomfort. Davenport, however, was lost in thought. He tapped a finger against his chin, then spoke slowly. "Talent burns bright, but too much too soon. Success at an early age is a dangerous thing. The world takes notice, and not always in kind." He turned to Mr. Harland, seated silently in the dimly lit corner. "Wouldn't you agree?" Harland smiled, his dark eyes glinting with something unreadable. "You have a way of seeing things, Mr. Davenport, a way of knowing what most overlook." Evelyn stood smoothing the folds of her dress. "Come, let us retire to my study. It's far more comfortable there." She led them through the grand hallway, their footsteps echoing against the polished floor. As they entered the room, Davenport halted mid-step. His gaze was drawn immediately to an object against the far wall, a towering lacquered screen, deep crimson and gold, adorned with intricate scenes of an ancient empire. There was something almost hypnotic about it. "You approve?" Evelyn's voice was soft, yet there was a challenge in it. Davenport hesitated, feeling an unexpected weight in the air. "It's magnificent. More than that, it's singular." John stepped forward, eyes gleaming with nostalgia. "We acquired it early in our marriage, paid a fraction of its worth, but even that left us struggling for a time, didn't it, Evelyn?" His wife nodded. "I remember." John chuckled. "Of course things are different now. Just last week I saw a fine collection at Sotheby's, perfect additions to match this piece, complete the theme. But Evelyn refuses. "I like the room as it is," she said simply. Yet something in her expression unsettled Davenport. He glanced around, only now noticing what was absent. No personal mementos, no photographs, no flowers. It was a room of taste, but devoid of life. Evelyn must have caught his reaction, because she leaned in slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper. "Some things we buy with money, others, with something far more precious." John scoffed. "Sentimentality, Davenport. She clings to the past, says we paid for that screen with more than just money." Evelyn turned to her husband with a quiet, knowing smile. "We did." There was silence, stretching too long to be comfortable. To break it, Davenport shifted the subject. "I met Miss Fairchild in the garden earlier. She mentioned she'll be performing as Pierrette in tonight's recital." "Yes," John said, "and she's quite good. Her movements lack refinement," Evelyn stated plainly. John frowned. "Jealousy, my dear. She's a beautiful girl, and you know how women can be with one another." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "I meant her dancing." Davenport quickly redirected. "I understand 2 professional dancers are arriving tonight." "Yes, for the ballet," John confirmed. "Prince Orlov is bringing them himself." Evelyn stilled. Something flickered across her face. "Prince Orlov." John turned to her, his brows furrowing. "You know him." Her lips curved, but the smile never reached her eyes. Once, in Russia, Davenport observed John's reaction, his jaw tightening, his posture stiffening ever so slightly. "Will he remember you?" "Oh yes," she murmured. There was a note of amusement in her voice. "He will remember me," and then she laughed, low, rich, almost triumphant. For the first time she no longer seemed like the poised, elegant Englishwoman she had always presented herself to be. There was something else beneath the surface, something undiscovered. John abruptly turned and left the room, his shoulders tense. Harland followed, silent as a shadow. Evelyn walked to the telephone, fingers resting lightly on the receiver. She stopped Davenport as he made to leave. "Wait," she said, her voice smooth, deliberate. And in that moment, he realized, this was not just a conversation. This was the beginning of something far, far deeper, something veiled in secrets, and he was standing in the middle of it. The heavy drapes of the grand estate swayed as a chilling wind swept through the dimly lit drawing room. Lady Evelyn sat poised by the fireplace, her sharp eyes reflecting the flickering embers. The silence was broken by the urgent ringing of the telephone. With a deliberate grace, she lifted the receiver. "Yes, who is this?" Her voice was smooth, unshaken. A pause, then a hushed, hurried voice. "It's me, Nicholas." She stiffened. "Nicholas. But you, no time. Listen carefully. The accident wasn't an accident. The dancers were never meant to arrive." The flames crackled louder, as if protesting the weight of his words. Evelyn's fingers tightened around the receiver. "You mean," a sharp breath on the other end. "Someone planned this, and whoever it is, they're here. Tonight." A slow, cold dread settled in her chest. She turned her gaze toward the large bay window. Outside, the shadows stretched unnaturally long beneath the full moon. Someone was watching. She could feel it. "I need proof," she whispered. A rustle of papers, a low exhale. "Check the red envelope in the library, but be careful. They're already suspicious of you." The line went dead. Evelyn remained still for a moment before rising, her gown whispering against the marble floor. The grand estate, once familiar, now felt like a labyrinth of secrets. She moved toward the library, heart pounding, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against her back. As she reached for the library door, a sudden sound behind her made her spin. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not Nicholas. She wasn't alone. The words caught in his throat, as though they had conspired against him, refusing to emerge. A strange, suffocating silence stretched between them before Anna Denman exhaled sharply, her voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Folly," she murmured, her tone laced with something unreadable, contempt, regret, or perhaps something far more elusive. She turned swiftly and vanished through the doorway, leaving Mr. Satterthwaite alone, his unspoken confession hanging in the charged air like a ghost. By the time he descended for dinner, the mood had shifted. Anna Denman was no longer the cryptic enigma she had been moments before. Now, she was the effortless hostess, seated beside a man who carried himself with a quiet, commanding presence. Prince Orlov, Mr. Satterthwaite. The two men exchanged polite bows, though Satterthwaite could not shake the unsettling certainty that his entrance had interrupted something weighty, something that would not be revisited in his presence. Yet the conversation resumed with such ease that the strain beneath it was almost imperceptible. Almost. Orlov, a man of refined taste, spoke with an understanding of art that resonated with Satterthwaite. They found common ground in names and places, in forgotten masterpieces, and whispered scandals of the artistic elite. John Denman soon joined them, and the discussion took a local turn. It was then that Orlov, in his smooth Russian accent, expressed regret over the accident. "It was not my fault," he said simply. "Yes, I drive fast, but I do not drive recklessly. This was fate, chance." He shrugged, a gesture that carried centuries of Russian fatalism within it. "The masters of us all." Anna Denman's lips curled slightly. "There speaks the Russian in you, Sergei Ivanovitch, and finds an echo in you, Anna Mikhailovna," he returned smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Satterthwaite observed them, his keen mind assembling pieces of a puzzle whose image had yet to form. There was something here, something beyond mere acquaintance. He studied them as if they were players on a stage, the fair and distant John Denman, English, through and through, and the two others, dark and strangely alike. Recognition stirred in his mind, an echo from another time. Ah yes, Siegmund and Sieglind, bound by something deeper than fate, and the foreign presence of Hunding, watching from the shadows. A flicker of unease coiled within him. Was this why Mr. Quin had appeared? There was one thing Satterthwaite had learned: wherever Quin was, drama was sure to follow. But was this truly the drama he had anticipated? A love triangle, old as time, rearing its head once more. He felt a vague sense of disappointment. He had expected something more, something greater. "What have you arranged, Anna?" John Denman's voice broke the quiet hum of speculation. "I assume the performance must be postponed." Anna merely smiled, shaking her head. "No, there is no need. But you can't do it without the ballet." She leaned back, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Of course not. A Harlequinade without Harlequin and Columbine would be absurd." Her voice carried a deliberate pause before she delivered the revelation. "So I shall be Columbine, John." A flicker of something unreadable, shock, perhaps even fear, crossed John's face. "You." His voice wavered, betraying a disturbing Satterthwaite could not yet name. She inclined her head. "You needn't be concerned, John. I won't shame you. You forget, it was my profession once." Satterthwaite leaned back in his chair, the weight of realization settling upon him. He had seen many things in his life, but the strangest of them all was how a voice could say so much, even in silence. The words Anna had spoken were plain enough, but beneath them lay an entire world of unspoken history. He longed to decipher it. "Well," John muttered reluctantly, "that solves half the problem, but the other." His gaze hardened. "Who will play Harlequin?" A hush settled over the table, thick with an unspoken answer, and for the first time that evening, Satterthwaite thought he knew. As the night progressed, tension lingered in the air like an unseen force, crackling just beneath the surface of ordinary conversation. Mr. Satterthwaite, his mind still whirling with fragmented thoughts, found himself distracted by the quiet but intense atmosphere around him. Then, just as the conversation shifted, there he was, Mr. Quin, the enigmatic figure, who seemed to appear at precisely the right moment. His entrance, calm and unruffled, carried a mysterious energy that seemed to both settle and stir the room. John Denman, momentarily thrown off guard, gave him an appraising glance. "Do you know anything about this strange game?" he asked, his voice edged with a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. Quin's smile was as enigmatic as ever, and with a knowing glance, he answered smoothly, "I am merely an observer." But it was Mrs. Denman who defended him, declaring with a smirk that Mr. Satterthwaite himself would vouch for Quin, leaving him, as always, feeling the weight of his subtle yet unwavering involvement in the unfolding drama. A mere murmur of agreement escaped Mr. Satterthwaite's lips, an affirmation of something much deeper. Denman, not wasting a moment, turned the conversation to more mundane matters, but the sense that something larger was at play still hung in the air like a shadow. The evening moved on, but as the dinner settled into a quiet lull, the conversation flowed naturally, disguising the palpable undercurrent of anticipation that everyone seemed to be trying and failing to ignore. In the midst of it all, a costume party was being discussed, and even as the trivialities of costumes and roles were tossed about carelessly, Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't shake the feeling that each mask worn that evening was more than just a costume. It was a metaphor for the hidden truths and secrets that swirled under the surface. The mention of Molly's Pierrette costume, with her nervous excitement, only deepened the mystery. There she was, radiant in her youthful energy, yet her words trembled with insecurity as she confessed her fear of failure. But it was Anna Denman's unsettling response that caught his attention. Her cold, distant smile, paired with her casual remarks, left an eerie feeling in the room, and as the evening wound down, the sounds of Molly's Irish ballad echoed through the room, but even the sweet, innocent music couldn't mask the unsettling tension building between the characters, each playing their role, unaware of the twisted path that was slowly unfolding around them. The performance of a lifetime was about to begin, and yet, none of them knew that the true drama lay not on the stage, but in the mystery that was just beginning to unravel before their eyes. As Molly's song echoed through the room, its melancholic lyrics seemed to linger in the air, drawing a strange connection between past and present, light and shadow, Her voice, sweet and natural, resonated deeply, yet there was something about the words that felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved. "I see a lad that loves me, and I see a lad that leaves me," she sang, her tone a mixture of longing and sorrow, "and a third lad, a shadow lad, and he's the lad that grieves me." It was a simple ballad, yet its depth pulled Mr. Satterthwaite into an unshakable sense of mystery, as if the song held a secret message just for him. As the final note faded, Mr. Satterthwaite nodded in approval, genuinely moved by her performance. "Mrs. Denman is right," he remarked, his voice thoughtful. "Your voice is charming, not fully trained perhaps, but it carries an unstudied quality that speaks of youth and natural grace." Molly, slightly emboldened by the praise, beamed, yet there was still a nervousness lingering in her eyes, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake off. John Denman, however, interrupted the moment, eager to push the night forward. "That's enough, Molly. Don't worry about stage fright. Let's get going. We're expected at the Rosheimers." The conversation shifted, but Mr. Satterthwaite found his mind still circling around the odd lyrics of Molly's song and the strange figure it described, the shadow lad, a phantom presence, who seemed to haunt her words. As the group moved to leave, cloaks were donned and preparations made for the short walk to the Rosheimers' house, but Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't escape the feeling that something more was unfolding beneath the surface. The night was crisp and clear, and as they stepped out into the cool air, he found himself walking alongside Mr. Quin, the enigmatic figure who had once again appeared at the right moment. "It's odd," Mr. Satterthwaite murmured, "but that song, it made me think of you. The shadow lad, there's mystery there, and wherever there's mystery, I think of you." Mr. Quin's smile deepened, but his eyes remained unreadable. "Am I so mysterious?" he asked, his voice soft, yet carrying an air of something untold. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded, his thoughts tumbling over themselves. "Yes," he said with quiet conviction, "but until tonight, I had no idea that you were a professional dancer." Mr. Quin's eyebrows rose in mild surprise, but he offered no explanation. "Listen, Mr. Satterthwaite continued, humming a tune that had lingered in his head since dinner, the love motif from the walk. "This is what's been in my mind as I've watched those two," he said, pointing subtly toward Prince Oranoff and Mrs. Denman. "Do you see the change in her tonight? It's as though a shutter has opened, and now you see the glow within her." Mr. Quin listened, his dark eyes flickering with a hint of recognition. "Yes," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Perhaps so." Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't help but continue. "It's the same old drama, isn't it? Those two, they belong together. They think the same thoughts, dream the same dreams. You can see how it has all come about. 10 years ago, Denman must have been a striking figure, dashing, youthful, full of romance, and he saved her life, all very natural. But now what is he? A good fellow, prosperous and successful, yes, but mediocre." His voice took on a hint of disdain. "He's like that Heppel-white furniture upstairs, well-made, functional, but ordinary, just like that pretty English girl with her sweet, untrained voice. And don't you deny it, Mr. Quin." Mr. Quin did not reply immediately, but his expression remained calm, unreadable. "I deny nothing," he said after a moment. "In what you see you are always right." And yet, his voice trailed off, and the air around them seemed to grow heavier. Mr. Satterthwaite, puzzled, leaned in. "Yet what?" he asked. But Mr. Quin only stared at him, his eyes full of some unknown sorrow. "Have you learned so little of life?" Mr. Quin's words were like a quiet whisper in the wind, leaving Mr. Satterthwaite with an unsettling sense of disquiet, as if there was more to these words, and to the evening, than he could ever fully understand. Satterthwaite stood by the garden door, deeply engrossed in his thoughts. He had no idea that the others had already begun their walk without him. He had lost track of time, while carefully selecting a scarf to complement his outfit. The soft glow of moonlight bathed the narrow lane as he made his way through the familiar door, stepping out into the crisp night air. As he lingered for a moment, he caught sight of a couple entwined in each other's arms, their silhouettes framed by the silver light. He hesitated, his mind racing, unsure if he recognized them. A sudden burst of emotion struck him as John Denman's voice reached his ears, raw and desperate. "I can't live without you. What are we to do, Mr. Satterthwaite?" Instinctively turned to retreat, but a sudden grip on his arm halted his steps. He looked up, meeting the eyes of another person standing beside him, someone whose gaze, too, had fallen upon the couple. In that instant, he recognized her, and a wave of realization swept over him. His earlier assumptions had been completely wrong. Her face betrayed an anguish he hadn't expected, and it was clear that the night held much more complexity than he had first believed. Her hand, still resting on his arm, remained there as the couple walked away down the lane, disappearing into the shadows. He found himself speaking words of comfort, though they seemed feeble, lacking the depth he longed to offer. Her solitary reply, a simple "please, don't leave me," struck him with an intensity he hadn't anticipated, leaving him momentarily disoriented. He continued to speak softly, offering reassurances that felt inadequate, yet were better than silence. As they walked together toward the Rochegamer's house, he sensed her reliance on his presence, her grip on his shoulder tightening occasionally, a silent plea for support. When they arrived at their destination, she suddenly released him, standing tall, her posture a mixture of strength and resolve. "Now," she declared, "I shall dance. Do not worry for me, my friend. I shall dance." With that she left him abruptly, and he was swept away by Lady Rochegamer's theatrics, a cascade of lamentations about the evening's ruined plans. Lady Rochegamer's then passed him along to Claude Wickham, who, drowning in his own self-pity, lamented his misfortune over and over again, oblivious to everything but his perceived failures. Mr. Satterthwaite, now fully awake to his surroundings, watched as the first notes of music filled the air. The scene transformed before his eyes. Wickham, while insufferable in his complaints, had undeniable musical talent, creating delicate compositions that had the ability to captivate without resorting to superficial charm. The atmosphere was carefully crafted, a vision of Arcadia come to life, with ethereal lighting that transported everyone into a world of fantasy. On the makeshift stage, two dancers moved in an eternal dance, their movements enchanting. A slender Harlequin glittered beneath the moonlight, his mask hiding his identity, while a white Columbine spun gracefully, as if embodying an ageless dream. The surreal scene unfolded in front of him, leaving Mr. Satterthwaite both entranced and perplexed, unable to shake the tension that had been building throughout the evening. What was it that lingered just beyond the surface of this gathering? Mr. Satterthwaite sat up with a sudden clarity, as though a veil had been lifted. He had been here before, this strange haunting sensation that seemed to echo from a distant memory. His body, now distant from Lady Rochegamer's drawing room, transported him to the cold, quiet halls of a Berlin museum, where he stood before a timeless statuette of Columbine, forever frozen in her dance. The figures of Harlequin and Columbine danced on in his mind, an eternal ballet, their world boundless as moonlight bathed them in its ethereal glow. The soft strains of a human voice interrupted his reverie, a melancholy tune sung by Pierrot, wandering through the woods, his heart heavy with longing. The figures of Harlequin and Columbine faded, but Columbine, her gaze lingering, turned back for just a moment, as if she had heard the song of a human heart, Pierrot's mournful love drifting away into the distance. The scene shifted to the village green, where girls danced joyfully, their laughter filling the air. Molly, in her role as Pierrette, joined them, her voice carrying the tune of Pierrette dancing on the green, a bright and tuneful melody that Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't help but approve of. Despite his distaste for the majority of the village girls, he recognized Lady Rochegamer's unrelenting attempt at philanthropy. The dance continued, but Pierrot, with a white face and an aching heart, refused to join in. His soul, restless and searching for his ideal, wandered through the evening shadows, as Harlequin and Columbine, unseen, danced amidst the unconscious crowd. As night fell, the place grew deserted, leaving only Pierrot, weary and forlorn, to fall asleep on a grassy bank. Harlequin and Columbine danced around him, but when he awoke, it was Columbine he saw, and he pleaded for her love. Yet she stood still, torn between him and the beckoning Harlequin, who silently urged her to leave him behind. But Columbine, no longer listening to Harlequin, heard only Pierrot's song of undying love, and with a final resigned sigh, she fell into his arms. The curtain fell. The second act began in Pierrot's humble cottage, where Columbine sat, pale and exhausted, caught in a web of longing for something she could not name. Pierrot's voice, steady and persistent, sang to her, coaxing her back to him. But as the evening darkened, and the first rumbles of thunder filled the air, Columbine stood, restless. She listened not to Pierrot's call, but to something else, a melody that stirred her very soul, the music of Harlequin and Columbine, the sound of a deep undeniable connection that transcended the ordinary. As a crash of thunder shattered the stillness, Harlequin appeared in the doorway. Pierrot, unable to see him, was unaware of the danger to his heart. But Columbine, her spirit alight with recognition, sprang to her feet with a joyful laugh. Children rushed to her side, but she gently pushed them aside, knowing that the time had come. Another thunderous crash echoed through the air, and with it, the walls of her world crumbled. She stepped out into the wild night, dancing with Harlequin. As the darkness enveloped them, Pierrot's tune lingered in the air, slowly fading as light began to creep into the scene. The cottage, once a symbol of love lost, now stood abandoned, the echoes of the dance still whispering in the night. Pierrot and Pierrette, their once youthful spirits now aged and grey, sat quietly before the fire in two armchairs, the soft crackling of the flames providing a comforting rhythm. The music playing in the background was joyful, but it carried an undertone of wistful nostalgia, as if echoing the passage of time. Pierrette, her eyes heavy with sleep, nodded in her chair, her hand resting lightly on the armrest. Through the window, a silver shaft of moonlight slanted into the room, bringing with it the long-forgotten melody of Pierrot's song. His tired eyes fluttered open, stirred by the soft music, the tune that had once consumed his heart. But just as quickly as the music faded, a faint, otherworldly melody filled the air, fairy-like and distant, the sound of Harlequin and Columbine, dancing once more in the world beyond. Without warning, the door swung open, and Columbine, radiant and ageless, danced into the room, a vision from another time. She leaned over Pierrot, who was still asleep, and kissed him gently on the lips. Then, as if the very heavens themselves responded, a thunderous crash shook the air. Columbine was gone in an instant, slipping out into the night like a fleeting shadow. Through the lighted window, Pierrette caught a glimpse of Harlequin and Columbine, still dancing, their forms growing smaller and fainter as they disappeared into the distance. The storm raged outside, and Pierrette, her patience worn thin, jumped up with a sharp movement. She stormed across the room, and yanked the blind down with a decisive tug, closing off the scene. The sudden discord in the music mirrored her own disquiet, as the warmth of the fire seemed to fade into the cold, heavy silence. Meanwhile, Mr. Satterthwaite, sitting among the applause and the flurry of excited voices, remained still, lost in the profound strangeness of what he had just witnessed. The world around him seemed to fade as his thoughts circled, and eventually, he rose from his seat, and made his way outside, the cool night air greeting him like an old friend. In the garden, he found Molly Stanwell, flushed with excitement as she received compliments for her performance. Nearby, he spotted John Denman, his face alight with a new fervor, pushing his way through the crowd. Molly approached Mr. Satterthwaite, but he, almost absent-mindedly, brushed past her, his attention drawn elsewhere. His voice, soft but urgent, broke through the buzz of the evening. "My wife, where is she?" he asked, his gaze scanning the crowd. "I think she went out to the garden," Molly replied, unaware of the weight behind his words. It wasn't long before Mr. Satterthwaite found her, sitting alone on a stone bench beneath a cypress tree, her posture graceful, yet burdened with something unspoken. As he approached, something unexpected happened. He knelt before her, and in an intimate gesture, pressed her hand gently to his lips. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "Ah," she said softly, "you think I danced well." He smiled, the faintest hint of sadness in his eyes. "You danced, as you always danced, Madame Carson." Oh, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. "So you have guessed. There is only one Carson." "Oh," he replied, his voice thick with memory. "No one could see you dance and forget. But why? Why leave it all behind? Her eyes darkened, and for a moment, she was far away. What else is possible? She said simply. A great dancer. Yes, she can have lovers. But a husband, that's different. He didn't want the other. He wanted me, as I could never belong to Casanova. Mr. Satterthwaite's heart tightened with understanding. So you gave it up? He asked gently. She nodded, her expression soft but resolute. I did. You must have loved him very much, Mr. Satterthwaite said, his voice filled with sympathy. To make such a sacrifice. She laughed, but it was not a joyful sound. Not quite that, she replied, her tone light yet wistful. I made it so, easily. He looked at her, contemplating the weight of her words. And now? He asked quietly. Her face grew serious, her eyes darkened with something she had been hiding. Now, she repeated. She paused, glancing into the shadows before lifting her gaze to the heavens. Now, I'm not so sure anymore. The words hung in the air, pregnant with a mystery that seemed far from over. As the night embraced the quiet landscape, the soft moonlight revealed an unexpected scene. A figure emerged from the shadows, her steps graceful, but her heart weighed heavy with decisions unspoken. The long-lost figure of Anna Casanova reappeared, her past intertwined with the very soul of the man she was now about to leave. Prince Oronov, standing beneath the same sky that once separated them, gazed at her with a look of profound recognition. 10 years I mourned your loss, Anna. Today, I have found you again. No more shall we part, he declared, his voice carrying the weight of a decade's yearning. Anna, calm yet burdened, nodded solemnly. Their reunion was bittersweet, the moonlight casting an ethereal glow on their reunion, but it was not without a shadow of uncertainty. Meanwhile, Mr. Satterthwaite, who had silently observed the entire exchange, struggled with the mystery of the situation. Anna, so poised and distant, spoke of time, love and inevitability, with a strange finality that unsettled him. She spoke of love as a fleeting illusion, a mere dream conjured by music, moonlight, and past memories, an unfulfilled longing that could only exist in the realm of myth. But there was more to it. The illusion was beginning to crack. Mr. Satterthwaite's intuition, sharp as ever, whispered that something darker was afoot. A twist of fate was looming, and his mind raced to connect the dots. His heart quickened as the moonlit scene shifted, and through the veil of the shadows, 2 figures approached him, one of them unmistakably Oronov, garbed as Harlequin, but the other. His mind reeled, the mist of the night parting to reveal the truth. It was Quin, standing at the crossroads of life and death, the very essence of Harlequin himself. This was no mere reunion, it was a dance with the inevitable, a waltz into the arms of fate. The deeper he delved into the unfolding mystery, the more he felt the cold tendrils of reality slipping away, leaving only the thrill of what was yet to come. They continued down the lane, their steps as light as if the ground beneath them had turned to air. But as Mr. Satterthwaite observed Miss Quin, something unsettling washed over him. The face that had always been so familiar now seemed strange, alien even, yet not entirely unrecognizable. It was the face of someone he had known long ago, John Denman, though this version was far younger, full of raw energy and hope. The face of a boy on the cusp of an adventure. His features, once full of youthful dreams, now bore the imprint of someone who had never known defeat. A face brimming with the wild allure of a lover on the verge of something powerful. The laughter of Anna floated in the air, pure and carefree, blending with the night's soft hum. In the distance, a cottage stood bathed in golden light, its windows glowing warmly. Mr. Satterthwaite watched them, caught in the haze of a dream, unsure of what was real and what was illusion. His reverie was shattered when a hand clamped down, hard, on his shoulder, yanking him back to the present. He spun around to find Sergius Oronov, now pale and panicked, his voice sharp with fear. Where is she? Where did she go? She promised she would be here. The urgency in his words cut through the stillness of the night. From behind the aim, Mrs. Denman's maid stepped into the light, her eyes wide with confusion. She went up the lane, alone, saying, I saw her pass just moments ago. Mr. Satterthwaite's heart raced as he demanded, Alone? Are you sure she was alone? The maid, taken aback, nodded, her gaze full of innocence. Yes, sir. Didn't you see her off? A wave of dread washed over Mr. Satterthwaite. Grabbing Oranoff by the arm, he muttered urgently, "Quickly, we must hurry, something's wrong." Together they rushed down the lane, Oranoff rambling in a fidget state. She was perfect tonight, wasn't she? Like no other. When she danced the Columbine, she always dreamed of a Harlequin, a perfect Harlequin. It's always been that way. I remember she said it. She needed him, not someone real, but an idea. She danced with an illusion, with Harlequin himself. The words lingered in Mr. Satterthwaite's mind, though his thoughts were fixed elsewhere. "We have to be in time," he repeated under his breath, his mind racing as they reached the final bend in the path. They arrived at the pit, but it was not empty. A figure lay in the center, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on her body. Anna Casanova, in her final dramatic pose, arms outstretched, head tilted back, a serene, almost triumphant expression frozen on her face. Her beauty was undiminished in death, her body a tragic, graceful spectacle. Mr. Satterthwaite's mind struggled to piece together the surreal scene before him. The words of Mr. Quin echoed faintly in his mind, wonderful things on a rubbish heap. Now in the presence of this dark reality, he understood them all too well. Oranoff was whispering broken words, his voice thick with grief, tears streaming down his pale face. "I loved her. I always loved her." His words mirrored those Mr. Satterthwaite had heard earlier, though now they sounded hollow, as if they were more of a desperate plea than a declaration of truth. "She and I, we shared the same world, we had the same thoughts, the same dreams. I would have loved her always." Oranoff's voice cracked, his pain palpable in the moonlit night. Mr. Satterthwaite, his mind racing, couldn't help but question him. "How do you know?" The words escaped his lips sharper than he intended. Oranoff looked at him with confusion, his expression one of disbelief. "How do you know?" Mr. Satterthwaite pressed on, his tone now tinged with frustration. "Those are words all lovers say, but there's always one who—" His sentence trailed off as he turned abruptly, nearly colliding with Mr. Quin. His heart skipped a beat at the sudden appearance of the man, his mind still reeling from Oranoff's words. "It was you, Mr. Satterthwaite blurted, grabbing Quin's arm and pulling him aside. His voice filled with urgency. "You were with her, weren't you?" Mr. Quin paused, his gaze steady and calm before he spoke, his voice soft yet deliberate. "You can put it that way, if you like." Mr. Satterthwaite's mind whirled with questions. "And the maid, she didn't see you?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. "The maid didn't see me," Quin replied simply, "but I did." "Why?" Mr. Satterthwaite demanded, his heart racing as a chill ran down his spine. Quin's answer came cryptically, almost as if he were speaking a riddle. "Perhaps as a result of the price you've paid, you see things that others do not." The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning that Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't yet grasp. As the words sank in, a deep, unsettling realization began to stir within him. He took a step back, his body trembling. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What is this place?" Quin's answer was calm, almost detached. "I told you earlier today, it's my lane." The words sent a shiver through Mr. Satterthwaite. "A lover's lane," he murmured, his voice tinged with the weight of understanding. "And people pass down it." Quin's voice remained level. "Most people, sooner or later, and at the end of it, what do they find?" Mr. Satterthwaite asked, his heart pounding. Quin's lips curved into a small knowing smile, but his eyes held a sadness that spoke volumes. He gestured toward the ruined cottage above them, the faint light from the distant cottage barely casting shadows over the wreckage. "The house of their dreams, or a rubbish heap," Quin said gently. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and Mr. Satterthwaite's mind reeled as a surge of emotion filled him. He looked at Quin in disbelief, feeling something within him crack. "But his voice shook with the force of his emotions. "I have never passed down your lane." Quin's presence seemed to grow, his figure looming larger in Mr. Satterthwaite's vision, casting an almost oppressive shadow. "And do you regret it?" Mr. Quin asked, his voice carrying a weight that made Mr. Satterthwaite's knees weaken. He tried to rally, but the question hit him like a blow to the chest. "No," he stammered, though the words felt like they had been wrenched from him. Then, in a sudden burst of clarity, he cried out, "But I see things. I may have been a spectator to life, but I see things others don't. You said it yourself. He grasped at the last shred of his defiance, but when he turned back to Quin, the man had vanished, just as mysteriously as he had appeared. Quin was gone, leaving Mr. Satterthwaite alone in the moonlight, his mind tangled with questions, uncertainty, and a profound unease that seemed to have no end.